Welcome to the Highland Wonders Podcast, where we share stories and knowledge from experts about the charismatic species and diverse ecosystems of the Okanogan Highlands of north central Washington. My name is Jen Weddle, and I am one of the co-directors of Okanogan Highlands Alliance, a nonprofit conservation organization dedicated to protecting the beautiful Okanogan Highlands. This episode features the Jackie Chan of the ungulate world. Dignified yet nimble, bighorn sheep are just breathtaking, especially when caught posing with their huge, curling horns silhouetted against the sky. And they're not just a pretty face. Bighorn sheep keep our local biologists on their toes as they, the bighorn sheep, not the biologists, wander the Okanogan Valley, rub noses with domestic sheep, turn up in unexpected places, and engage in international affairs with their Canadian counterparts. As Jeff Heinlen of the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife says,
Never a dull moment with bighorn sheep.
Get ready to be immersed in the world of the bighorn sheep, their biology and habits, the challenges they face, and the unique herds that inhabit Okanogan County. In 2012, Jeff Heinlen presented at OHA's Indoor Highland Wonders Speaker Series. In early December, he sat down with us again to give an update on how our local herds have been doing over the last several years. What you are about to hear is a combination of Jeff's 2012 talk and the recent 2020 update. So enjoy.
Life is what we make it. It's all that we are. We're all what it is. 'Cause we're living with blessed unrest.
So thanks for coming tonight. I'm Jeff Heinlen. I'm a wildlife biologist for the Washington State Department of Fish and Wildlife. My hope is tonight that you guys gain an appreciation for the bighorn sheep, a little bit about what they are, where they've been, or what happened to them in the county, and then what we're doing to keep them in the county. So California bighorn sheep is a species we have, Ovis canadensis california. They're in the family Bovidae. They do ruminate. They're closely related to cattle, antelopes, and goats. The California bighorn sheep, the males weigh up to 200 pounds. The males have the big curls, the big horns, and that can be 8 to 12% of their body mass. So they can be up to 30 pounds. Pretty large. The Rocky Mountain subspecies, which I'll talk about a little bit later on, the males can be up to 300 pounds, so their horns are more massive in comparison to their body as well. It takes about 7-8 years for a ram to get to a full curl. At that point, they're very, very majestic animals. The California females weigh up to 150 pounds. They have much smaller horns, and then lambs, of course, just nubs. All bighorn sheep are adapted for living in rugged habitat, cliffs, talus slopes, and it's escape habitat. It's how they can escape from predators. Not many predators can chase a bighorn sheep on a cliff. Their digits, each digit on their hoof moves independently of each other, and that helps them grip as well. The back part of each pad is really rubbery, soft and rubbery, and allows them to cling to steep rock. It's their hoof that really helps them stay on the cliffs, and obviously they've got to have incredible balance as well. So in late fall, the rams start their head butting. It's quite a show, puts out quite a sound when they actually do it. On Mount Hull, I've actually observed rams sparring and head butting on top of the gravel piles at Gavin's pit. And so if you look at the pit, they flatten off the tops of the gravel piles, and I've seen the males up there sparring. If you have nothing better to do in the fall, go to Gavin's gravel pit, watch them spar. Breeding occurs in late November to early December. Lambing occurs late April to mid-June, with a peak in May around here. So they're born a little bit before the deer start hitting the ground. The lambing habitat, as with most ungulates, the ewes move away from all the others, find a safe, secure spot, kind of isolated. And for bighorn sheep, it's remote, rugged habitat. So it's talus, it's top of the talus. It's somewhere safe and secure where they drop their young. They keep their young there for a few days, until the young becomes pretty mobile. Within a couple days, the lambs are able to walk on the cliffs, jump, play in these steep habitats. But it's for those first couple days where the ewe keeps them there, keeps them in the isolated, secure habitats. Sheep thrive in areas where grass and shrub communities are interspersed with cliff and the talus habitats, or sometimes in alfalfa fields. It's that forage in relation to the escape habitat. In the summer, they're obviously feeding on grasses, forbs, some shrubs, but in the wintertime, their diet goes towards a completely shrub diet. They're also very social animals, more social than any of our other ungulates. And throughout the year, the ewes and lambs form these bands and hang together. The younger rams form ram groups, and they hang together most of the year, except for the breeding season. For the rams, it's, then they're fighting. They're not in a group. But the older rams, they'll form groups certain periods of the year. Winter and spring is a good time to see large rams hanging out together, which is quite an impressive sight when you're able to see 10 or 12 three-quarter curl rams hanging together. It's a pretty cool sight. So they're a pretty social animal throughout most of the year. Sheep eat more grass, more forbs. Deer can browse more. So I don't know if there might be some competition, but I don't know if it's a detriment. I don't know if it's a negative, if it's to the point where it's negative on the bighorn sheep. Bighorn sheep access different habitats than the whitetail. Whitetail love the river valley. The bighorn sheep love the sides, the cliffs. There's food in those cliffs as well. They're ranging from valley bottom to the top. The sheep tend to go in higher elevation and stay on the cliffs in the wintertime more than the whitetails. The whitetails hang lower elevation, so there's kind of an elevation split in the wintertime. So that might reduce the competition. Bighorn sheep are actually one of the few ungulates that it's easier to age. On the rams, and even on the ewes to a certain degree, the rams lay down rings. And so with our California bighorn sheep and the Rocky Mountain bighorn sheep, those two subspecies, their horns actually stop growing in the winter months. The desert species, their horns stop growing in the summer months. But during that time when the horn stops growing, it lays down a ring. That start and stop process of growing develops a ring. And so they can actually be counted by the rings. Up until a certain age, when the rings become so narrow, they're hard to distinguish. And there's also normal rippling in a horn, which can sometimes be mistaken for a ring. What this shows is your first 5 years, the ram is really putting on the growth on his horn. And, the whole point is to get big enough to spar, to win breeding. And those first 5 years are real critical. So nutrition plays a role, genetics plays somewhat of a role. But if he has good nutrition those first 5 years, he's growing fast and he's going to dominate. And so good nutrition is optimal for the rams for the first few years. The ewes, obviously their horns are much smaller, less circumference, less length, obviously less curl to them. And they lay down rings as well. Older ewes, their horns may not grow every year. And so the ring counting is not as accurate in the ewes as it is in the rams. 12 years is an old ram. There's variances with every animal out there, but on average, 10, 12 years is a good lifespan for a ram. Also with sheep, the way they lose their baby teeth on their incisors is characteristic for the first 4 years of life, so you can age them by which baby teeth they still have up till 4 years of age. And then after that, the tooth cementum lays down a ring, and you can actually, you have to get an incisor tooth, you have to cut it in half, and there's rings in those teeth just like a tree lays down a ring, and you can put it under a microscope and read it. And that's common in many species. Bears have that, deer have that, and bighorn sheep have that. So the cementum annuli is the most accurate way of aging a sheep, but beyond that, for the rams, the horns is the most accurate way. In the lower 48 and up into Canada a bit, we have Ovis canadensis and then seven subspecies. We have Ovis Dali, which are the doll sheep, and the stone sheep. And they're up in Alaska, they're up in the Yukon, they're up in the higher latitudes. Down here, we have Orvis canadensis, broken into 7 subspecies. In Washington State, we have Ovis canadensis californius, the Californian bighorn, and we also have the Rocky Mountain bighorn, subspecies canadensis. Ovis canadensis, the Rocky Mountain. Okay, so the Californian are in the center part of our state, and the Rockies are up in the northeast corner and the southeast corner of the state. So that's our distribution in Washington State. The Californians run from British Columbia all the way down to, almost southern California. The Rockies, the Rocky Mountain subspecies, covers much more of the West. Subspecies Auduboni is actually declared extinct, and then it was determined to be extinct by the 1930s. And it's the one that went into the Dakotas a little bit. The Nelson subspecies, the peninsular subspecies, the Mexican subspecies, and the Weems subspecies are all technically considered desert bighorn sheep. You never hear like the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, describe them by their subspecies names. They usually call them deserts or Californians or Rockies. But the deserts are actually broken up into a number of subspecies. The deserts are a little smaller. The Rockies are bigger. Californians are medium. That's the simplest way to characterize it. Taxonomy biologists, they get into brain cranium size. They get down to the picky details. The peninsular in Southern California and down into Baja and the Weems actually have some protections on them as far as listing criteria goes. I'm not sure exactly what Mexico has on them, but they're not hunted. They're actually protected, those 2 subspecies. The deserts, the rest of the deserts, the Rockies and the Californians are healthy populations and are able to have hunting seasons on them. So, one of my favorite stories, we have Californians here and Rockies here. Those are all reintroduced populations. By the 1930s, bighorn sheep were extirpated from the state of Washington. So the question is, how did we know we had them in Washington State? What's the evidence that they were ever here? And I got a hold of this book, which is great, The Big Game of North America by Men Who Have Hunted It. How cool is that? This was published in 1890, and this is fantastic. I only have this one little portion that talks about the bighorn sheep. This book discusses hunting of all large game throughout North America prior to 1890 by the men who have hunted it. So there's polar bear, there's grizzly bear, there's muskox, the wildcat, which is a bobcat, elk, mule deer, goat, moose. It's all big game species prior to 1890. In this story, Shields is the editor who compiled this book, but he's also the gentleman that wrote the bighorn sheep account. So he restated his account of hunting bighorn sheep in North America. And in 1887, him and a gentleman, one of his friends, he never states where he starts, but he took the train to Spokane Falls. And from Spokane Falls, he took a stagecoach to Loomis. And from Loomis, he took a horse to Chapaka Mountain. And he states why he comes to Chapaka Mountain, because that's the last best sheep hunting in the lower 48. And he recounts in his story, by 1887, Colorado is hard-pressed to find a bighorn sheep anymore, where they used to be abundant. Most of the herds in the West are declining, according to his account. So Chapaka Mountain is one of the last great places for men who hunt it. So he made this journey to come to Chapaka Mountain. So him and a friend come to Chapaka Mountain, and he harvests 2 rams on Chapaka Mountain. And then they move on to the Ashinola, where the Ashinola River enters into the Smilkameen River 30 miles north into BC. And there he runs into a gentleman from Victoria who has just killed 9 of the largest rams in that herd. And this gentleman, Shields, goes on to shoot 3 more rams, 3 ewes, and a ram, or a lamb, I mean. And he shot the lamb and the ewe and the rams because he wanted a whole family group on his wall. So part of why they were extirpated from Washington State was obviously overhunting, unregulated harvest. That was part of it. And then disease was also a main factor on why they were extirpated from the West. As settlement came, so did the domestic sheep. And with domestic sheep came pneumonia. And pneumonia can wipe out a bighorn sheep herd. And so between unregulated hunting and disease, we lost our bighorn sheep in the state of Washington. But here's my plea. If anybody has the entire book, I would love to have this thing. Okay, there's my plea. I want to read the grizzly bear account. Okay, so let's change from kind of what a sheep is and kind of their history to what herds do we have in Okanogan and around us. It's pretty well, not understood, but agreed upon by the archaeological evidence that the center of our state was Californian subspecies, was the Californian. Up here, there's debate on whether they were Rockies or Californians. That debate has kind of shifted towards most likely Rockies. So we did reintroduce Rockies there based on historical accounts of the fur trappers that came around and the diaries they left. Any archaeological evidence from Native American sites where they found evidence of bighorn sheep. So, yeah, we have put back what we thought was historically there. So the herds we have, we have Mount Hull. That's one of our herds. We have Sinlahican herd, and there's a herd at Omak Lake. Those are the ones that we have within Okanogan County. Hell's Gate Reserve is in the bottom of Ferry County. Vaso Lake is in British Columbia. Manson is North Shore Lake Chelan, and Chelan Butte is by the town of Chelan. This is what is around the county that influences our sheep. I'm going to talk about all these individually. I'm not going to mention Manson or Chelan Butte other than one of these two herds, and we're not sure which one it is, whether the Manson's coming down to the river or Chelan Butte is just moving upriver. But we do get these herds coming to the south part of the county. They come up to Wells Dam. They're on the highway there. They're on the cliffs to the west. But we don't know that they're moving any further up valley. So maybe as the herd grows, they'll move. But right now, that's where they go. So the Sinlahican herd is actually a very important herd for bighorn sheep management in the state of Washington because that was the first herd to be reintroduced back to the state after the extirpation in the 1930s. They actually went up to Williams Lake and brought Canadian sheep. And again, British Columbia was the best place. After the 1930s, British Columbia had the best populations of bighorn sheep. There was a few left in California, but British Columbia was basically the core habitat at that time for the bighorn sheep. So we brought 18 sheep from Williams Lake down to the Sinlahican herd. We put them in a 500-acre exclosure, or they did back then, and the sheep thrived. The sheep did really well. They expanded within the exclosure. They started letting them out of the exclosure, and they continued to grow quite rapidly. So they were introduced in 1957. Over the years, we've also augmented from Kamloops and John Day. John Day was most recently as 2001 that we brought more sheep in. But after the 1957 reintroduction, they grew well, and in the 60s through the 80s, we were actually able to start or augment 11 different bighorn sheep herds throughout our state and additional states from the Sinlahican herd. So when you drive through Loomis and you see the bighorn sheep, there's actually a lot of history there. They started a tremendous amount of herds throughout Washington and other states. A little bit about the Sinlahican herd. It's actually managed solely by Washington State Department of Fish and Wildlife. We manage it to ensure a healthy, productive population. It's also managed for recreational hunting and viewing opportunities. And as anybody who's driven through Loomis, they view them, right? They're there. Basically from Blue Lake Sinlahican to north of Palmer Lake in the Sinlahican Valley, and then out to Spectacle Lake as well, and a little bit up Sinlahican Creek. Quite a range, actually.
In 2012, Jeff reported that the Sinlahican herd was made up of 90 to 100 animals, and that summer the 55 ewes had produced only 7 lambs, which was a very poor showing for this herd. At that time, he was wondering, is this an anomaly or is something really going on? And to answer that question, they had started to monitor the herd more closely. So Jeff, how has the Sinlahican herd been doing since 2012?
Right. Well, thanks, Jen. Thanks for letting me come back and update everybody on the herds. Sinlahican herd, well, we identified a parasitic mite in the herd, and the Canadians identified it as well. Actually, they identified it a month before we did in their herds. We know the herds are connected, and so they actually had a research project to identify where the Soroptes mite came from into their herd, because it was the first time in British Columbia. It was the first time that their herds had been infected by this mite. And so they want to know where it came from. They funded a grad student. A little bit about the mite. The mite it resides in the ears for the most part, and occasionally on individual sheep, it can expand outside the ears and infest the whole body. And at that point, the sheep basically itches so much, it clips its hair off with its teeth, and it can succumb to bad weather, especially in the winter months. So it can kill individual sheep, but it's not known to kill the whole population or to cause a reduction in the population.
If it stays in the ear, is it harmful to the sheep?
It's only harmful when the mite builds up in higher numbers, comes out of the ear, and causes such severe itching that the sheep basically clips its hair off. While it's in the ear, it does, basically, for lack of a better word, make skunk in the ear and can reduce hearing in the sheep. And there's some theory that can make them more prone to predation or to like road accidents, but we haven't seen that in the Sinlahican herd. So the Canadians hired a researcher to figure out where the mite came from. Their best theory is it actually came from their side. Outside of Penticton, they had a game farm. This mite also resides in rabbits. They know that the rabbits at the game farm had the mites. There was also bighorn sheep at the game farm, and they believe that interactions on the farm led the sheep to be infected. And then the sheep, some of the sheep escaped. There's a theory that when the game farm shut down, the sheep were released. That's just a theory, I don't know. But that's how the Canadians feel it got into their herd. Their herd is connected to our herd, so both herds are infected. So anyway, we identified the mite, and subsequently at the same time the population declined. But like I said, the mite in the literature and in other herds across the West that have been infected, the mite does not cause a population decline. So that was confusing. Why is there a population decline? Why did the herd decline in the Sinlahican? We don't believe it was from the mite, but we've captured and tested, and we've tested mortalities that we found, and we've not found pneumonia, which is the primary reason bighorn sheep populations decline. So we're a little stumped. So this herd has me stumped. The herd, it declined by about half, and then it just kind of settled there. So we're kind of low. Because of that, we've removed all hunting permits, so there's no more hunting in that herd. We're still trying to determine why the decline occurred, and we're hoping for a reversal.
Real quick, before we move on, can you tell us more about treatments for the mite and for pneumonia in sheep?
When we capture, like when we did our radio collaring in the Sinlahican, after we discovered the Soroptes mite, every sheep that we captured, we treated for the mite. Treatment for this mite in domestic sheep was found back in the 1920s. So it's easily treatable through a sheep dip or medication in the ears. The problem is we can't catch every animal. That's the problem. And it would take us catching every animal and the Canadian population being captured and treated as well. And that's impossible. So, like I said, the sheep and goat owners have a treatment for Chiroptes mites. That's easily treatable. It's the pneumonia that's the concern when there's an interaction between a domestic sheep or goat and a wild bighorn. So the domestic sheep and goats, they're immune from the pneumonia that infects bighorns. They don't succumb to it like the bighorn sheep do. I guess the concern is when there is an interaction between a domestic and a wild bighorn sheep, the pneumonia transmission is the concern. And how do we prevent that? There's no treatment for pneumonia once the bighorn sheep gets infected. The best course of action for keeping bighorn sheep pneumonia free is separation of domestic sheep and goats from the wild bighorn sheep herds.
How close is too close?
For a while it was thought that they had to make contact, rub noses, but then one research project found that that's not necessarily the case. It can be transmitted at some type of distance. The further, the better.
For people with domestic sheep who want to install a double fence, how far away should the two fences be?
Yeah, I think 4 or 5 feet would be sufficient to stop that. Yeah, double fencing is a great method for keeping the wild and the domestics apart. You can test your domestics. Not every domestic carries MOVI, and the agency, you can contact us about testing. The test is a nasal swab. That's all it is, and it's sent to Washington State University. If you're in the Sinlahican area, if you're in the Mount Hull area, if you have any questions about bighorn sheep or domestics and bighorn sheep, give me a call or shoot me an email. That's probably the best. If you have a positive sheep, or maybe a treatment, or maybe you sell that sheep and get a clean one. So that's kind of the Sinlahican. We're just kind of in a holding pattern. So that's with the animals, but with the habitat, we have not been waiting. We've actually been managing, actively doing good in the Sinlahican for the bighorn sheep.
In this clip from 2012, Jeff explains one of the major challenges facing bighorn sheep in the Sinlahican Valley.
The Sinlahican Valley is pretty narrow to begin with, not a lot of winter range during optimal conditions. And then over time, there's more trees, more shrubs, that's less grass. A sheep will also only forage as far as he can see from his escape habitat, from that cliff or that talus. And so as trees grow up, that sight distance gets shorter and shorter and shorter. And that also limits how far they forage, that limits our winter range. Naturally, we naturally have limited winter range in the Sinlahican Valley. And as the trees have encroached, we've continued to lose that.
So, what has WDFW done to support bighorn sheep in their foraging habitat in the Sinlahican since 2012?
Part of my talk in 2012, I mentioned that we had a grad student from Washington State University, Tiffany Baker, was starting her master's project, radio collared a number of bighorn sheep in the herd, and she tracked them to determine their habitat preference in the Sinlahican. And what her thesis showed was they select for obviously habitats that have a low density canopy cover. So they don't like a thick forest. They like a more open forest closer to the rocky habitats. And of course, bighorn sheep, their escape habitat is the rocks, the cliffs. So they don't want to forage too far away from their escape habitat. Okay, when the forest grows thick next to a cliff, next to their escape habitat, that reduces the amount of forage available to them. They don't like thick canopy. They don't like to be too far away from their escape habitat. So as the forest grows thicker around the cliffs, they lose foraging ability. Her thesis showed this. So in the Sinlahican, starting with manager Dale Swedberg, we've been logging and doing commercial and pre-commercial thinning out there. And WDFW has a prescribed fire team. They've been conducting prescribed fires. Yeah, ever since my last talk. It looks great. We've had great thinning projects out there, all for the benefit of the bighorn sheep. So at least habitat-wise, we've been doing a lot. That's kind of the Sinlahican.
So Mount Hull. Mount Hull was started with 7 bighorn sheep in 1970 from the Clemens herd. Clemens herd was started from the Sinlahican herd. Since then, we've augmented from Kamloops and from John Day, Oregon, and we've actually exported sheep 2009 and 2011 to the Hell's Gate Reserve herd, which I'll talk about here in a minute. The Mount Hull herd, Mount Hull actually falls within the Colville Confederated Tribe North half, where they have subsistence hunting and gathering rights. So they are co-managed by the tribe. How this affects the herd is basically we just put up the same number of tags. So if WDFW harvests a ram, they'll harvest a ram. It's been a good partnership, and it's working well. There is actually a black market for bighorn sheep head and horns. They used to be branded. Now it's this pin. When a bighorn is harvested, be it a ram or a ewe, they have to receive a pin. So that's also part of what we do. And it's just to negate the black market trafficking. A permit for a bighorn sheep is a once-in-a-lifetime draw for a hunter. And hunters put in a lot of years of applying before they get drawn. The majority of the hunters are out there before opening day, and they know which ram they're going to get. They put a lot of time, a lot of effort. It's a lifetime hunt for them, and they love it. They absolutely eat it up. And then here's the biologist coming with a power drill. And I tell you, they take a moment and they stand back, and I do a lot of explaining on how I'm not going to ruin their trophy. It's kind of funny every time I pull out the power drill and trying to explain to them that I'm going to drill into this trophy animal they just took. But we have to. I have not messed one up yet. I have it down to a fine art, and everybody's been pretty pleased so far. It's also managed to ensure a healthy, productive population. Mount Hull has been, it's been pretty neat to watch. From 1970 to 2000, it kind of hung on. It was about 50 animals, got up 50, 60 animals, and then the Rocky Hull fire burned. I don't know how many of you remember that or seen it. Rocky Hull burned 9,000 acres. It actually took some buildings. It was quite a wildfire. It was wind-driven and whipped through that 9,000 acres pretty quickly. So very sorry that people lost their buildings. However, it was fantastic for the bighorn sheep. So it took out a lot of conifer trees. It took out a lot of the old shrubs. It revamped the forbs. It revitalized the habitat for the bighorn sheep. That burned in 2000, 2001. We kind of saw a dip in the population. And then from 2002, 2003, from that point on, we started to see a real growth curve in this herd. It was great to watch. I will say that the Forest Service was actually doing prescribed burning on Mount Hull specifically to encourage or to revamp the range for bighorn sheep. So the Forest Service was doing it. Rocky Hull Fire just did it better. That's all. It took more acres. So some of the challenges with Mount Hull, as the population increased after the Rocky Hull Fire, we saw an uptick in roadkill. And that was a concern to us. One, the safety on the highway, and two, the demise of our bighorn sheep. We saw an uptick in roadkill. With the increase in the herd, we saw an uptick in agriculture damage. The biggest thing that I think drives the bighorn sheep down, most of the roadkill was in August and September. In August and September, things are pretty dry and crispy on top of Mount Hull on that west face. But if you look down, if you're a sheep up on this dry, crispy slope, and you look down, and there's all this irrigated alfalfa and irrigated orchard, where are you going to be? I think it's just, that's where the green, lush forage is down in the valley bottom during that time of year. And that's what brought them down, that and the river. I've actually seen them pass through orchards to actually get at the native forage. I don't believe that the grasses and the trees are as palatable as the natural forage for them. So if they had a choice, they'll take the natural forage. So what did we do? We did talk about a fence. From 2003 to about 2006, we averaged about 4 sheep a year being struck on the highway. We erected signs, if some of you've seen those. Signs are somewhat effective. Over time, people block them out of their minds and just keep driving. We decided to trap and relocate some of the sheep, and we also implemented ewe harvest for the first time. And so we put up 2 ewes. That means Colville tribe also put up 2 ewes. And ours, one of ours went to a youth only, which I thought was a pretty nice move to give our youth a chance at an animal species that's pretty unique. In 2009, the Colville Confederated Tribe actually won a grant to reestablish bighorn sheep on their reservation. It was a native species for them. They wanted it back as a cultural, both culturally and as recreation on the reservation. We said, we have too many sheep. We put it out to all the western states on, hey, does anybody want sheep? And the Colvilles responded that they'll take them. So we tried the corral trap for the first time. It worked okay. Not great. We didn't get the results that we wanted. We set this up in 2009. You bait it with hay and apples. One thing that was interesting, it's not the cage that keeps the sheep in. Sheep will not run through anything it cannot see through. You watch them go in there, and you actually remotely drop these big black sheets. They're actually weighted with railroad ties, and so they just drop down real quick. And that's actually what traps the sheep. And so you make the curtains drop, and you run up there, and you close the door. So we dropped the curtain, we ran up there, we closed the door, and then somebody goes inside and puts them, there's actually a little chute-type scenario in there, and I was the guy to run in there, okay? So I ran in, the guy behind me closed the door, and I got all these sheep doing circles around me. And I'm like, oh, man, I got to get them in there. And so I went, hey! I just yelled at them, and they all ran through the door except for one ewe. One ewe, which surprised me, one ewe jumped so high, she got her front legs over the top of that tarp, which was 11 feet. And then she slid down the tarp and went in, and we caught her. I was very impressed. The ability of these animals to jump is just incredible. So it was pretty cool. The next time we trapped, we brought back the helicopter, and they did very well. I think we've removed a total of 18 sheep off the mountain, and they've all gone to the Hell's Gate Reserve, which is the herd that the Colvilles have started. Oh, and by the way, we had no roadkill in 2011 or 2010, and in 07 through 09, we averaged 1 to 3 every year. I can claim it was us. I don't really know. I don't really know why there's a decrease in roadkill, but there is, so that's kind of where we're at with it. Mount Hull, we have domestic dogs. So again, same issues as this in Lincoln. We have dogs chasing our sheep. We have domestics in close proximity. Last fall, boy, what a weekend I had. So I get a phone call. This lady informs me she is taking care of one of my bighorn sheep lambs. And I'm like, really? What happened? She saw a dog she didn't know, basically pummel this lamb up against a fence in her pasture. She ran out and dragged the dog off. The dog had it by the throat and was shaking it pretty well when she shooed the dog away. She took the lamb to a vet, and the vet inspected the lamb and sent it home with her and said, take care of it for 3 days and it should be okay. I'm like, well, let me come take a look and see what's going on. And so she has this lamb in this little shed, which was no bigger than 10 by 10, which is fine, I guess. But 200 feet away, she had 9 domestic sheep. And so I'm like, great. There was no interaction between the sheep and the domestics and this guy. I didn't want the sheep that close to the domestics, so we arranged to take the sheep back to the vet, and the vet could monitor the sheep for 3 days. So this is a Friday. Everything happens on a Friday afternoon at 5, okay? So this was Friday afternoon at 5. So we took the sheep back to the vet. Very nice of the vet to take the sheep. I asked the vet, what kind of pen do you have for this sheep? Because, that one sheep can jump 11 feet. I'm thinking it's going to be pretty hard to confine a sheep. He said, we have a quarantine horse stall with walls to the ceiling. I'm like, great, put him in there. So I took the sheep down. I handed him off, and I went home. Then I go, I'll be back Monday morning. Sunday morning, I get a phone call from the vet. Come get your sheep. And I'm like, really? What's going on? Come get your sheep. Okay, I'm there. So I went, and yeah, the walls went to the ceiling, but the door did not. And the sheep got out. The sheep, being a sheep, climbed on every shelf in this guy's building. So the stall was in a corner of his bigger building. The sheep climbs on every shelf, knocks everything off, works its way through the dog kennel into an operating table, got up on the stainless steel table and bumped the faucet, turned on the faucet and flooded his operating room, and proceeded to climb on every shelf in the operating room. So when I get there, Quickly, I may add. The sheep is back in the horse stall, hog-tied with a blanket over it. So I put an ear tag in the lamb, and I let it go back on the mountain. Unfortunately, I've not seen the lamb since. I personally don't believe it made it. So dogs are definitely an issue to both of these herds. We have fence issues. I forgot to mention one of our largest rams in Sinlahican was hung up on a fence this year and died. I don't know how he got on a fence. It was a fence in downtown Loomis. It was a very nice ram, though. Fences are an issue on Mount Hull and out there. Not really sure what to do about it. Domestics, again, the plea, if anybody has domestics near these herds or near any bighorn sheep, please double fence and make a barrier so the disease transmission is negated.
The last we heard about this herd, the bighorn sheep on Mount Hull were doing pretty well. Is that still the case?
In the Mount Hull herd, that's been an interesting few years as well. So bighorn sheep, always interesting. Back in 2012, population was fine. It was doing good. That herd, the Mount Hull herd, didn't have many issues. I think it was in 2014, we actually got up to like 128 animals in the herd. It was the highest population documented in the herd. It was exciting. We were doing great, and everything was just going well. Yeah, in February 2019, we got a report of a dead ram. We went and collected the ram, conducted a necropsy, sent samples off, and the ram had pneumonia. Pneumonia in a bighorn sheep herd can be very devastating to the population. In most cases, when pneumonia gets into a bighorn sheep herd, it can reduce that population anywhere from 85 to 90%, 95%. With the Tieton herd in Yakima, WDFW actually eliminated the herd because of the risk of spreading to additional herds. It took out about 95% of the herd. We removed the rest. It can be pretty devastating. In some cases, it is not that devastating. This is the minority of pneumonia outbreaks where the population has a 10 to 20% die-off, not a 80 to 95% die-off. So we identified pneumonia in the herd. It was concerning to us. We monitored the herd, and what we found was our large rams were succumbing. We were finding mortality in large rams. One ewe tested positive, but that was about it. And surveys showed the population did not really decline. It seems like we kind of got lucky with this one. Back in 2019, when we identified the pneumonia, we didn't know what it was going to do, so we removed our permits, our hunting permits. We have seen a lower lamb survival through 2019, so we have not re-implemented our harvest because mainly our large rams succumbed to pneumonia, and the lamb survival isn't exactly where we want it to be. The Colville tribe, and they also pulled their permits as well. When we identified the pneumonia, the agent that we look for it's called MOV. It's Mycoplasma ovi-pneumonia. That's what we test for, that's what we sample for. MOV comes from domestic sheep or domestic goats. So from the bighorn sheep herd, when we documented it, Washington State University ran all the samples. They also conducted strain typing to figure out if this was from domestic sheep or domestic goats. And it came back as a new strain from domestic sheep. We don't know which domestic sheep or where they came from, but we know it's a sheep strain, a domestic sheep strain, not a domestic goat strain. The other nugget of that is Mount Hull is connected again to the Canadian herds on the east side of their Okanogan, just across the border in Osoyoos. And their sheep herd goes from Osoyoos all the way up to Kelowna on the east side of their Okanogan Valley. They also have a herd on the west side of their valley, and that's the herd that's connected to the Sinlahican population. So Mount Hull is connected. We know that sheep walk back and forth across the border. And then we also know that Mount Hull is connected to Omak Lake, which is on the Colville Indian Reservation. So now Mount Hull gets infected, and we're like, now what's going to happen? Sheep walk. The Canadians and the tribe were obviously very interested in what was going on with Mount Hull. This year in July 2020, the Canadians started seeing dead lambs. They tested these lambs, and it came back as a match to the Mount Hull strain. So it has gone up into Canada, which is unfortunate. So far this year, they're seeing the effects in their lambs. They're losing lambs, whereas we saw mainly our large rams. So it's the same strain, but it's acting a little differently. It's going to be interesting to see if the Canadian herd has a large die-off or not. We don't know yet. It hasn't run its course up there. They're monitoring, and we're waiting to see. So far, Omak Lake they haven't documented anything wrong with Omak Lake yet. Yeah, that's nice.
How long does it take pneumonia to run its course? Will they know by next summer?
Pneumonia is a very hard disease to get rid of in a herd, so they should know. One thing I've learned is wildlife always, when you say something, they always do something else. By next year, they should be able to determine if they're having a large die-off or a minimal die-off, okay? But the interesting thing with pneumonia is once it's in the herd, it affects that herd for 10 to 12 years or longer in some cases. So the sheep that live through pneumonia, some of those sheep can clear themselves of pneumonia. It's like when we get a cold, we get over it and it's gone. Same with the pneumonia. Some of the sheep can get rid of it. Others of the sheep become carriers and they spread it continually. So say a ewe is infected, when she has a lamb, she infects that lamb. So even if there's a few spreaders in the herd, they can infect the lamb crop of the next year. And sheep live 10, 12 years, so they can continually spread to their lambs. So you'll see poor lamb recruitment for, 10, 12 years. That's the devastating part about pneumonia.
With the way these animals move around, what are the potential implications for other herds? It seems like the Sinlahican could contract pneumonia from the Mount Hull herd via Omak Lake.
Yeah, correct. And this is the issue. So obviously the pneumonia went from Mount Hull to Canada, which is a much shorter distance than Mount Hull to Omak Lake. But we know Mount Hull and Omak Lake are connected, that they walk back and forth. So yeah, it could easily reach there. That's the same concern with the Chiroptes mite in the Sinlahican herd in the US and in the Canadian herds north of the border that have Chiroptes. You get these sheep that go on a walkabout, and if you have an infected sheep that ends up in an uninfected herd, then that's not what we want. The problem is it's very hard to detect every movement of sheep between the herds. So how do you stop that? How do you prevent that? It's very challenging. I know that the Canadian grad student who was researching where their Chiroptes mite originated was also looking into suitable treatments, but I don't know what he came up with. Treatments for a wild herd is very challenging. You cannot catch every animal in a wild herd. And so if you miss treatment of one infected animal, you just reinfect your entire herd again. So it's very, very difficult. Setting out medication like an assault block or something. How do you get the dosing right when they have to eat it? Some will eat too little, some will eat too much, right? So many challenges with these fun issues. Yeah. That's kind of where we are with Mount Hull. But again, habitat-wise, the Forest Service started a project, the Chenasket Ranger District, to, again, conduct pre-commercial thinning and prescribe fire in bighorn sheep habitat on the Forest Service lands for Mount Hull. And WDFW partnered with them the Washington State Wild Sheep Foundation partnered with them, DNR partnered with them. There was a whole lot of entities that came together to partner technically and to fund this project. So right now, the Forest Service just started their thinning this fall, and I think they've thinned up to 700 acres in sheep habitat. So there's good habitat work going on Mount Hull. And this area hasn't been managed for over 40 years. So it's a good thing. So last year, I think it was last summer, not this summer, there was that fire on Mount Hull. There was a small 300-acre fire in the shrub steppe, and that was on the south part of their range. And that kind of revamped the grasses. New grass is good for bighorn sheep. So I've been finding them in there. Activities like that or disturbances like that might make them move a little south, in the southern part of their range. Who knows what makes them move, but they don't stay in one spot all the time. Wild animals, go figure. They just go on a walkabout. They just end up places where they reside. It's interesting. Habitat projects keep moving forward. It's doing great. Yeah, we just need to work on the population a little bit. Let's wait and see what happens. On another note, the Colville tribe is hoping to deploy radio collars, and WDFW is adding radio collars to the project. So hopefully we'll have some radio collar data from Mount Hull. Mount Hull has not really ever had a good amount of radio collars in it to determine where the sheep go, how they interact, how much movement occurs between Canada and Mount Hull and Omak Lake. So we're hoping to get some radio collars in this January with the tribe conducting a capture and radio collar project. We still have our roadkill issues, but not as great, Yeah, back in the early 2000s, 2006 to 2008, for some reason, Highway 97, we were having a bit of roadkill issues. I know that some more fencing has gone up around the orchards. I think that's probably helped. Still happens occasionally, but it's not to the number that we had. We were having 4 or 5 a year back then, and now we're down to 1 or 2.
Jeff has mentioned the Omak Lake Bighorn Sheep herd a couple of times so far. Here he is in 2012 explaining why this herd is such an important part of the puzzle.
So Omak Lake is a very interesting herd. It's managed strictly by the Colville Confederated Tribes. It's fully within their reservation. It actually was naturally established. So one day it shows up, and everybody was wondering, where did these sheep come from? And the best corridor would be up to Mount Hull. It's north-south. There's no rivers to cross. There's no highways to cross. There's no housing areas to cross. It's the most natural corridor. Jerry King was a biologist here at the time in the mid-90s, and he swore to me up and down that they did not come from Mount Hull. They came from the Sinlahican. And that means they'd have to come out of the Sinlahican, cross Highway 97, cross the river, cross through orchards, a whole gauntlet of obstacles compared to going north-south to Mount Hull. But he was adamant. So I'm like, okay, they must have come from there. So the Colville tribe, when they got their grant to start their herd, their Hell's Gate reserve herd, they actually put radio collars on Mount Hull, and in that process, they collected DNA. They analyzed that DNA against the DNA of Mount Hull and Sinlahican herds. 4 of the 5 tied exactly to the Sinlahican herd. So Jerry King is vindicated. Jerry King said that they came out of the southern Sinlahican Valley, went through Pine Creek area, crossed north of Riverside, and then went straight down Tunk and straight into Omak Lake. That was their route. 1 tied to Mount Hull. Which one was that? Here's a very interesting thing the radio collars displayed from the tribe. November 14th, 2010, a 7-year-old ram left Omak Lake and went straight north, and he stays about a mile or 3 miles east of the river, and he went all the way to Mount Hull, and he hung out at Mount Hull. But on Christmas Day, he was back in Omak Lake. So this tells me that north-south corridor and that corridor from Sinlahican to Omak Lake is still present. There is some interaction. How much interaction between these herds, we don't know. But we know that there is. That has its pros and cons. It's good in the sense that we can get some genetic diversity between all the herds, that we don't have to keep moving them. There's some natural genetic exchange. That's great for the health of the herd. However, if Mount Hull gets a disease outbreak, can Omak Lake? Can Sinlahican? So it has its pros and cons. I don't know if they smell each other or if they follow the habitat. I think the one from Omak Lake actually came from Mount Hull and knew the route. I'm not sure how they find each other. Obviously, the ones that left the Sinlahican and ended up at Omak Lake, they weren't following anybody. They just started walking and found some great habitat and stayed. I also get reports of skulls in places where they shouldn't be, in really bad, like completely forested habitat with no cliff talus anywhere near. And those are guys that dispersed and completely went the wrong way. So it happens, you know. I think some leave and get lucky, and some leave and don't get lucky.
I have a question that may not relate to anything really, but we were at McLaughlin Canyon last spring and saw a bunch of bighorn sheep. Would they be most likely to be part of the Mount Hull herd?
Right, and that's my next quandary. What's going on in McLaughlin Falls? So yeah, I've seen big rams in there as well. McLaughlin Falls is in between Omak Lake and Mount Hull. We know that the sheep use those cliffs as they walk back and forth. They use that habitat. They also use the Tunk Grade outside of Riverside. There's been a lot of sightings there. I have even seen a wandering ram in the Tunk Grade. But what is unique about McLaughlin Falls is we seem to be having ewe and lamb groups, not just the wandering ram. Usually the bighorn sheep that makes the foray to the next herd is usually a young ram. For whatever reason, it's usually a young ram. But in McLaughlin Falls, we're getting reports of ewe and lamb groups. So it seems like they might be setting up shop there, like residing there. I'm not quite sure yet. It's one thing I keep looking at, but I haven't pinpointed yet. So it is one area that we're interested in. We would like to know if they are like residing there or if they are going back and forth just from McLaughlin Falls to Mount Hull, or are they going all the way to Omak Lake and back? We just don't know. And we're trying to pinpoint that.
If people see them in this area, do you want them to let you know?
Yes, absolutely. And pictures are good too. That way I can tell ewe and lamb, rams, date, location, pictures, all that's good. So
Okay.
yeah, if you see a bighorn sheep in McLaughlin Falls, the Tunk Grade, that'd be great. Any of that information is valuable. My gut feeling is we have a small herd in McLaughlin Falls. That's my gut feeling. I just can't prove it yet. Yeah, it's great habitat down there. I think they might have found it.
Thank you so much, Jeff, for taking the time to give us all of this great information and share your stories. Before we close, do you have any last thoughts for our listeners?
Well, you know, they're just fascinating animals. They're majestic, you know. The rams are big. Go find them. Go look at them and just see how wonderful they are. They're a pretty cool animal. We don't have too many bighorn sheep across the West as compared to pre-settlement days. Like people in Oroville who drive back and forth south probably see the sheep quite a bit and think, you know, oh, it's just more bighorn sheep. But there's a lot of people who don't see bighorn sheep every day. There's definitely an appreciation for these animals, and they're just pretty cool.
This podcast is produced by Okanogan Highlands Alliance. OHA is located in Tonasket, a town in the heart of the Okanogan Valley of north central Washington. We are inspired by the beauty and diversity of the landscape that surrounds us, from the aspen and conifer forests to the Highland lakes to the tumbling creeks that descend to the wide, glacier-carved Okanogan River Valley. We engage in environmental advocacy, habitat restoration, and educational activities in our efforts to protect local ecosystems for future generations. To learn more about OHA or to become a member, please visit our website, okanoganhighlands.org. Thanks to Jeff Heinlen for providing this presentation and the 2020 update on the Bighorn sheep herds of Okanogan County. If you have observations, questions, or concerns about Bighorn sheep to share with Jeff, email him at Jeffrey.Heinlen, Heinlen, at dfw.wa.gov. The theme song was written and performed by Tyler Graves and Andy Kingham.
Blessed